All right, let's get started. So, hi everyone again. Welcome to the Consumer Reports Car Privacy webinar, where we will be diving into the landscape of car privacy and steps to limit the sharing of your driving data. My name is Angel Han, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Digital Rights Campaign Manager here at Consumer Reports. I'm calling into this webinar today from Boston, Massachusetts on Pawtucket and Namkyag land. So first, let's go through the agenda. So we'll start by talking about the potential consequences and costs when your data is shared without your consent or knowledge. Our panelists will do quick intros on their work and their orgs, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Matt Schwartz, who is our privacy policy analyst, and Alan Smith, who is our community leadership manager. They will be moderating the chat, dropping links to resources that are mentioned throughout the webinar, and help answer any questions you may have. So before we get the show on the road, pun intended, I'm going to go over some housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar to share afterwards for folks who couldn't join, or in case you missed anything, you'll be able to access that recording. There's closed captioning available to make the webinar more accessible. You're able to enable it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to engage in chat. We won't have any polls for this webinar, but make sure to change sort of the option from hosts and panelists to everyone so that everyone can see your messages. Separate from the chat, there's also a Q&A function. So feel free to drop any questions you have for the panelists there, and people will try to answer them, and we'll try to answer them live during the webinar as well. And just a reminder, we are using Zoom, so any inappropriate behavior will be blocked. All right, that brings us to our ground rules. Assume best intentions of all participants, volunteers, speakers, and Consumer Reports staff. Be mindful and understanding of fellow participants who are coming from different experiences. Speak to your own perspectives and stories. Refrain from personal attacks or comments on appearances or voices. Focus on the topics under discussion. By attending this webinar, you are agreeing to these ground rules. This means if you don't adhere to these rules, we have permission to remove you from this discussion. We will drop a link to the ground rules as well. But with that, let's get started. So why are we here? Cars are increasingly becoming digital products with the integration of new technology. These two pictures of an early version of a car to a modern day car with a console in the middle really illustrates these changes. So while technologies like sensors and cameras can help drivers have more awareness of their surroundings, they can also enable automakers to collect a lot of information on us. So last year, a team at Mozilla Foundation read through the privacy policies of a bunch of different automakers and released a report on their findings. What they found may not be a surprise to you, but the Mozilla Foundation confirmed that car privacy policies are written vaguely, expansively, and in a confusing way for consumers. Many automakers take advantage of that fact that we don't have a federal comprehensive privacy law, so they give themselves the freedom to do whatever they want with our data, so long as it's written in the privacy policy. So that means they could profit off the sale of our data or use our data for their own purposes, such as training their own artificial intelligence systems. Fast forward to earlier this year, investigative journalists confirmed that some automakers are selling consumers' driving data with data brokers. Data brokers are third-party entities that aggregate our data on us from a bunch of different sources. And according to this article, these data brokers sold our driving data to car insurance companies. This all happened without consumers' knowledge and oftentimes without explicit consent from consumers. Insurance companies are interested in our driving data to identify unsafe drivers. And so some data they may use to label you as an unsafe driver are hard braking events and inferring that you're speeding by maybe comparing the distance you traveled during a trip and the time it took you to travel that distance. As a result, consumers in the article accused insurance companies of using this data behind their backs to either raise premiums or deny them insurance coverage altogether. Here at Consumer Reports, we launched a petition to the Federal Trade Commission to investigate automakers for any deceptive practices that led to consumers sharing their data, again, without their knowledge or explicit consent. And just this week, actually, the Federal Trade Commission announced they're going to be closely monitoring automakers' data collection and sales activity, just because, this is unacceptable. And so with that, our panelists. So today we've convened several experts around cars and privacy to talk through how we can protect our privacy in our cars while staying safe on the road. It's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Funkhauser, Adani Washington, and Thorin Klazowski. They'll give a quick intro of themselves and their work as it relates to car privacy, and I'll hand it off to CR's very own Kelly. Take it away.
Thanks, Angel, and hello and welcome to the webinar. I am joining you from Connecticut, where we have Consumer Reports Auto Test Track, which I changed my background to show you kind of a bird's eye view of what's actually right outside the window here. So here in Connecticut, we have our Auto Test Center where we purchase at least 50 different vehicles every year and run them through our slew of tests here. And my role at the Auto Test Center and at Consumer Reports is the Associate Director of Vehicle Technology. So I oversee the test programs that include everything from the usability while you're sitting in the car, the controls, the displays, infotainment features. That includes all of the apps and things like that that you can access through the screen. As well as some of the active safety and driver assistance technologies, where we're looking at all of the crash avoidance type of technologies, as well as those convenience features. And then I also oversee the testing of all of the connectivity, which includes the telematics, cellular type of subscriptions, hotspots, et cetera, and also some very rare and future to come type of technologies where in the future, cars may be able to talk to each other, and infrastructure and other types of systems and things in the world. So I oversee all of those. And as part of that, I have quite a bit of insight into what's actually on the car and the privacy concerns, as well as also some of the benefits that come with data, which means, sharing data or access to data in order to make certain features work. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about some of the data, but there are also some potential benefits that come with some of the data sharing as well. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. So I will pass it off to Adani to intro next.
Thanks, Kelly. Adani Washington, Policy Counsel for Mobility, Location, and Data at the Future of Privacy Forum. We have significant expertise on issues around vehicles and privacy, in addition to other areas in privacy, data, and technologies. We've been working on this issue since about 2014, organizing working groups of experts on this topic and contributing research and analysis on potential privacy risks and mitigations for vehicles. This includes independent research reports, again, working groups, convening different conversations, in addition to submitting comments at the federal level and having conversations around legislation and regulation as well. Most recently, I launched a report on the privacy implications of vehicle safety systems. So many of the systems that Kelly mentioned, and I'm sure many of the other ones that you all have heard of in your vehicles, the advanced driver assistance systems and driver monitoring systems and other impairment detection technologies. And in this report, we not only took surveys of consumers to understand how actual people are thinking about these technologies and the privacy implications for those technologies, but also provided a number of recommendations for developers, deployers, regulators, and anyone else in the ecosystem who is offering these technologies for vehicles. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what privacy implications exist. And if we could have the next slide. Thank you. So one of the things that we tried to do at the Future of Privacy Forum is provide kind of visual aids to really articulate what we mean. And so what Kelly kind of mentioned as well, as it relates to the different features of what's happening on the car, where that data comes from, where it goes to, that's what we've got illustrated here. So this can be found on the Future of Privacy Forum's website. But as you can see, there's a number of different, inputs for data, and there's a number of different places that data is going. I think the important thing that Kelly mentioned is some of that data does relate to personal information as it relates to the actual individual, be it the driver, passengers, or other occupants components in the car, but there's also a hefty subset of data that relates to actual vehicle functions and can play into regulation and reporting requirements to the governing body, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, who creates the federal motor vehicle safety standards for cars. So those were many mouthfuls, and I will pass it to Thorin, and I'm sure we'll cover more of the topics that FPF works on in the later portion of this panel. So to Thorin.
Hi, my name is Thorin Klosowski. I am joining from Los Angeles, where I hear there are quite a lot of cars, reportedly. I am a security and privacy activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting for digital rights. The easiest shorthand for a lot of the work that I do is that I'm the weirdo who opens up the settings app first thing whenever I download a product or buy something. And so after the New York Times recent report that Angel had alluded to earlier, I sat in a bunch of cars. I talked to my neighbors. I found all my friends that had cars and just sat in them and went through their infotainment systems. And we started filing CCPA requests. Since I'm in California, I can do data requests to get a little bit more information from companies to see what they have on us. And one of the more interesting examples that I kind of wanted to show here, just to kind of get us started and get everyone on the same page, is from Volvo, which we have a settings app here. The interesting thing about Volvo is in a lot of their newer cars, at least, they use Google. So you're kind of dealing with two companies, both Volvo and Google. So on this first slide, we just kind of see the settings app, and in the next slide, we'll see what the privacy settings look like. And there's a lot going on here. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see the first thing there, which is location access, kind of one of the more important things we think about. You'll be able to revoke and grant access to different apps. On the next slide, we will see the Volvo privacy settings, which is probably the most confusing thing and the place where you'll spend a good solid 20 minutes reading on what all of these things are and what they do. This has everything from whether the car transmits diagnostics data to whether it sends you alerts about road hazards. And the next slide, we'll see an option for deleting your profile. So if you're selling a car or if you're in a rental, this is what you would do. The next slide, we will see the Google settings. So a bunch of different things that deal with what Volvo is sharing with Google, what your car is sharing. And then the next one, we will see the advertising ID. Since this is Google, we of course have an ad ID associated with our car, which is a fun Google specific little thing. And then next one. An interesting thing that you can do with a Volvo, which I didn't see in a lot of cars, is you can actually disable that SIM entirely, which completely cuts off everything that is the car is sending, which is a rarity, actually. And I just wanted to kind of walk through this to sort of highlight what we're working with here, with at least from a consumer point of view, what you can do yourself, what this might look like, how many different screens there are, how confusing it is. And yeah, with that, I think we can turn it to discussion.
Awesome. I think we can take the slides down. Great. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. Very helpful information already being shared with the folks on this call. And we already have a couple questions coming through the chat, so hopefully we can answer them through this Q&A. So to start things off, let's kind of start with the basics. So what kind of data is being collected, transmitted, stored in cars, and how? Does a consumer have any control over that data? For instance, how can a consumer figure out if any personal data is being collected about them? And feel free, this one's kind of open for anyone to jump in.
I'll take a stab at it first. So I'll start by saying what data is being used, and then maybe I'll hand it off to my fellow panelists to answer what's being transmitted and stored. So in your vehicle, if you have kind of any vehicle that was built in the past, decade really, has lots of features in the car. Some of those are even driver profiles, right? So sometimes there are multiple key fobs, and you can link certain settings to a key fob, or sometimes even to facial recognition, so that your car is kind of set up for you when you get into the car. Those can include seat settings, mirror settings, and even things like your audio presets. So that data is being stored, usually on board on the car. But if in some vehicles where they use kind of facial recognition to do this, that's additional data that is being sometimes stored and sometimes offloaded off of the car. Other things that involve data. So in the infotainment, as Thorin actually just showed us on the screen there are lots of things that are involved in the infotainment system, which are some of the native apps, right? Sometimes you can have Spotify or other apps that are you can download into your system or just log into your account. So the example that Thorin showed using the Volvo, that operating system is actually built by Google, and it's called Android Automotive, not to be confused with Android Auto, which you might be more familiar with, where you plug in your Android smartphone and there's an overlay. The Android Automotive operating system is actually Google-based. And so you can log directly into those accounts using your Google information. Excuse me. There are other types of accounts and things that you can set up in there. And then going back to phone connectivity, right? You can plug in and have access to your phone. Speaking of phone, your smartphone often has what we call a companion app. So you may be able to download, the Volvo or the Subaru or the Honda version of the app that allows you to connect to your vehicle. In that app, oftentimes you can see where the vehicle is currently located, sometimes what speed the vehicle is currently traveling. You can oftentimes geofence the vehicle. So if the vehicle leaves a certain area, it will ping you or send you a text. So there's other concerns that even extend beyond the vehicle to these smartphone compatibility and apps as well. And then I did mention that there are sometimes pros, right? So having your profile automatically synced or downloaded is sometimes a good thing. But also sometimes you need data connection and connectivity to use other features like the active safety or other driver assist features effectively and correctly. So to use some of those lane centering type of features, or I'll refer to the generic autopilot type of systems out there, it's actually using your GPS location and other HD mapping data to be able to work correctly. So to have the ability to keep the car in the lane, it's actually drawing on some data. So in order to have that feature work correctly, the vehicle needs to know where it is in the physical world as well. And I think we'll circle back a little bit later. There are pros and cons to that. But that's just kind of a very general look at the type of data that is less in front of your face that you may not realize. But then there are other camera systems, especially related to driver assistance, right? There are in-cabin cameras looking at the driver, sometimes occupant sensors, whether those are camera, radar, sonar type sensors, and then exterior sensors as well, that all are collecting, sometimes storing, and sometimes transmitting data. So that's the general, very broad lay of the land, and I'll pass it off to my other panelists to talk a little bit more about actually what is being stored and transmitted.
Before, I would love to actually pass that one to Thorin, because I think, Kelly, you did a great job of laying out all the different aspects and features. I think one thing that we didn't say, and I kind of saw a couple questions that seemed to potentially allude to this, and I just want to say now, we cannot generalize. There are many, many different car manufacturers, and there are many, many different models that each manufacturer produces, right? And when we say connected vehicles, we are encompassing not only your everyday vehicle, but we're also encompassing at certain times autonomous vehicles. And so I'm assuming all of us will be very specific if we are specifically relating to something as it pertains to an autonomous vehicle versus a traditional passenger vehicle. I think we are, and most people are concerned about those traditional passenger vehicles here. But really, I think what Kelly mentioned in all of those features, it's going to look very different from manufacturer to manufacturer and from car to car. So we appreciate any questions that might be more specific, but if you just have kind of a general concept, that is something that we might be able to more specifically answer. But I think that is a very important level set here. And so Thorin, to you.
Yeah, and as you kind of alluded to there, I think often one of the general pieces of advice would be to check out the privacy policy for these cars, which already unreadable even when they are very well written sometimes. But with these cars, they just cover the entire car maker's everything that they make. So it doesn't really tell you much about, your specific model, or even trim sometimes will have different features. So there's not a ton you can do to figure out which data is being collected about you very specifically. There are some tools. There's a website called Privacy for Cars that you can type in your VIN and it'll give you a broad list of things. Reviews obviously will sometimes talk about certain things that might allude to like what's being collected. And if you're in a state with a consumer privacy law, you can usually file a request and ask for which data they have about you. These requests are kind of complicated to figure out sometimes. It's called a right to know, usually. There's only a handful of states you can do this in, and I've heard mixed reports on whether or not people in other states have gotten anything back. It kind of seems to depend on the day of the week, honestly, and maybe the car maker. But I think it's worth doing if you're curious about what your car is collecting and what the car maker has on you. I was able to see, for example, that one company had a list of every time a door was opened, which was kind of funny to look at, but also strange. And another company had absolutely nothing at all, because it was an older car that didn't really have much in it. So it's a worthwhile exercise to go through, I think.
Awesome. Thank you for sort of level setting with us here. So as Adani mentioned, understanding what data is collected and shared just cannot be generalized. So what are some steps consumers can take to protect their privacy while driving? Like what would be maybe the top 3 tips you have for protecting consumers' vehicle privacy? And I'm going to toss it to Thorn first for this one.
Yeah. This is so messy, as we already noted. And I do want to kind of just go through some bullet points here too, really quickly, just to kind of like do another level setting. Because we're talking about a lot of data going a lot of different places. Cars send data to insurance companies, often through intermediaries and data brokers. They collect and share analytics and diagnostics data. There's personal data that they might infer that gets shared with the car company for advertising and marketing purposes. There's data that might be shared with law enforcement, and there's data that might be gathered by law enforcement. There's data that might be collected or required by an employer. There's data that's inadvertently shared with a partner, ex-partner, parent for some type of non-consensual tracking. There's data that you might be inadvertently sharing through something like CarPlay or Android Auto. And there's data that might be shared through breaches or misused by rogue employees. Knowing all of that, there are some things we can do. And I think one of the biggest suggestions I have is if your car has an app or an infotainment system that's more modern, is to go through those settings like I showed earlier and just poke around. Look and see what you can find, turn off anything you're not comfortable with. If it messes something up in the car, you can always turn it back on. If you maybe lost a feature that you really use and like, don't worry about it. You can always turn that back on. If you find something that's called something along the lines of like car data or driver feedback or driver score, those are the features that are usually sharing data to insurance companies or might be sharing data to insurance companies. If you are not doing that intentionally, I would consider looking into that and turning it off, although be aware that that may change your insurance premiums for better or worse. But it is something that if you bought your car at a dealership, you may have turned on just in the excitement of getting a new car and you just, went through all the settings and turned everything on. So I think just spending a little bit of time with that, either in the app or the infotainment system, is good. The second is kind of while you're in there is just to be mindful of what your car or your partner's family car is capable of. So if you, like an example I like to give is my wife bought a car and I took it for a drive like right away because I was very excited too. And she texted me and let me know that like every time I stopped and parked, it was giving her a notification. Every time I opened the door, it was giving her a notification. And she just knew everything about what I was doing. And I had no clue that was going on. There's a very obvious potential for abuse in these sorts of situations. So if you share a car, especially, take a look at it, know what it's doing, know what it's capable of. And then finally, this is like sort of an adjacent thing, but if you are on iPhone or Android and you connect your car or your phone to your car, turn off those advertising IDs or the allow apps to track. It'll kind of cut off a little bit of that data and help a little bit. And if you're in one of those states with the consumer privacy law, you can actually file a request specifically to opt out of the sharing of data for marketing purposes. It's now I'm blanking on the name, but it's the same form that you do with the right to know. it just asks to opt out of data sharing. And yeah, those are kind of my tips anyway.
I'll just add one quick thing, or maybe I'll emphasize one thing that Thornton just said. I think the key is really to do that, to go in, sit in your car, in your driveway, in your garage, and actually go through all those, because it may not come as a surprise to you that most of these settings are on by default, right? So the car is going to get shipped with them on for obvious reasons. So, you know, there are a lot of people that never really get that deep in the menu settings. So I think taking the time to actually go through and toggle all of those off or opt out wherever you can is definitely the worthwhile exercise.
I'll echo that and also say that at that dealer level, so when you're going to buy the car or when you're going to buy the car from someone else, they might not have all of the full understanding of some of the questions as it relates to privacy or data that you're looking for. So the sitting in your car and kind of toggling to see what you can and can't turn off. I think the Volvo is a good example because there are some more capabilities in that car versus other cars. That should be said, of course, that the manufacturer does not sit in the US. And so I'm not sure if this was it doesn't sit in the US. So there's also differences. As someone in the chat mentioned, they gave a call to their manufacturer, which was Toyota. I'm assuming you called Toyota North America, and asked to opt out of different things. Certain manufacturers, again, will answer that call and do it that way, but there are other methods that are possible. I think one distinction is also to recognize where that car is coming from. Cars that are not built in the US can and are built in the EU, for instance, probably have some more of those options in their infotainment system, and even some more capabilities if you do like a Google search for those cars. And that is because they have that comprehensive privacy legislation that does protect them and provide some of those extra protections.
Awesome, amazing. I'm going to actually plug in something real quick, building off what Thorin and Adani said about certain states with comprehensive privacy laws and exercising the right to know. Certain states with comprehensive privacy laws also allow for residents to exercise the right to delete their data or have companies not sell their data. And so Consumer Reports, we developed an app called Permission Slip that acts as kind of like a consumer champion on your behalf. So you can make requests to companies, and there's a team here at Consumer Reports that will send requests to these companies that say, hey, we have a bunch of automakers like GM, Kia, I think Nissan. So it could be, so if I send a data request that says, I don't want Nissan to sell my data, I'll just do that through the Permission Slip app and they will contact Nissan. And sometimes we'll have to make our own requests. And we also include data brokers as well. One of the data brokers that was listed in that article in the New York Times about automakers sharing data is LexisNexis. And so we also make requests to data brokers as well to, not sell or to delete our data. So just wanted to plug that in there. So trying to keep track of all the questions that are flying through. So there is one question that a lot of people are asking. So when did all of this data kind of collection start? Does someone want to sort of give a sense?
Your car has been collecting data per se since it's existed. For instance, when we're talking about, you go to have your car worked on and it gives you the notification that, you need to change your engine oil. And then you go to the shop and they plug into the OBD2 port to kind of get the read of what's happening in your car. Those are data points that have kind of existed, even if you don't have a car that has all these newfangled features. You still kind of have that capability. So when we're talking about vehicle data, it's really important to understand that there is a large subset of data that relates to, did the engine turn over? Do you need to replace your oil, tire pressure, sorts of things like that. So that data exists. Now, this new kind of subset of data that comes from the new technological advancements and features that are in your car, we can't really put a year on it. Again, it kind of depends on the car manufacturer. For instance, my vehicle is a 2016. And so my most capable feature is Sirius satellite radio and Bluetooth. And those are the fanciest features that I kind of have. I have an infotainment screen that's got some clickable features, but not too many. So it does kind of just depend on the year. I would definitely say, I believe, Kelly, you said the last decade. I'd probably say closer to 2, maybe at this point, is when we've started to see some more of the new features and data points go into collection. And so I think that I hope that answers that question, but don't want to detract too far.
Yeah, I'll add quickly. So yeah, last decade and even more for some of the newer type of features, but and I just Googled the answer to this. So I looked, when did OnStar become a thing? And the answer Google told me was 1996. So generally, if you want to go out to your car after this and take a look, up in the headliner, kind of behind the rear view mirror, sometimes there are multiple buttons up there. If there's one that's labeled OnStar or something like SOS, or even in Hyundai brand for specifically, it's called Blue Link. So every brand has their own version of this, but those features themselves are connected features, right? They're essentially dialing a third-party service. So OnStar is owned by GM, General Motors. So if you have that brand of vehicle, you're going to have an OnStar button, right? And this can connect you to a third-party agent, generally owned. Each of the automakers have their own, and that can GPS locate your car, right? The intention behind all those is for if you're in a crash or you need roadside assistance or just any other type of, they sometimes call them concierge services, right? So if you go out and you see this button or a similar one in your car, know that there is the ability to have this type of connectivity in your car. So it definitely dates back longer than a decade, but it's really kind of the more recent stuff where it's almost exponentially adding all of these features to the car. But yeah, it's been out there for quite a while now.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So automakers claim that they need all of this data to keep us safe on the road. Is that accurate? Why or why not? And who else benefits from the collection of this data? I'll toss it to Kelly to start us off.
Sure. Yeah. So automakers claim a lot of things. And one of the things is that they need all of the data all of the time. And sometimes that's true, but I would argue that it's mostly not true. So some of the features that I mentioned earlier do require some data or even GPS locating to work properly. But I often hear automakers saying, well, we need the data about how the system is working so that we can make improvements to it for the next version. And just for kind of background on cars and how they're made and manufactured is there are a lot of suppliers that essentially sell bits and pieces of the car to automakers. So suppliers are really the ones that are creating sometimes like full systems as a solution. For example, for driver monitoring systems, there may be an infrared or just regular video type of camera or other sensors built into a driver monitoring system. The suppliers are making these and then selling it largely off the shelf to the automakers, who then build it into the integration of the full vehicle. Suppliers aren't selling a half-baked product, right? They are generally selling a solution that has been tested and proven before it ever makes it to automakers. So by the time the automaker gets it and builds it into the car, it doesn't necessarily need more data to make it better at that moment in time. And the data that may or may not be collected from the vehicle about that system rarely makes it all the way back to the supplier level. So again, it's the automakers or other telematics companies that are really collecting the data. It doesn't even always make it back to the suppliers. So I would argue that sometimes that argument works, but I would say the large majority of the time, it's not actually benefiting or helping develop the next version of a lot of the individual components of the vehicle. And some conversations I've had with suppliers on certain products, they actually tell me that they don't have the ability to record the data themselves. So any type of recording or storing or transmitting of data is actually added on at the automaker manufacturing level and wasn't ever even built into these products themselves. So this really, the onus and responsibility is truly on the automaker level.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And I think it's a really important point of like who benefits from that data collection if it's not being shared to the suppliers, and if it's not being even shared to drivers. If you're labeling me as an unsafe driver, well, why won't you tell me so I can improve my driving? So, great points there. So next question, what kind of safeguards should apply to the data that is being collected from cars, which are necessary to keep us safe, but do not compromise on privacy? What would you say are the best practices for car companies to follow to address privacy concerns in the vehicle industry? And would you say any of the auto manufacturers are living up to these standards? I'll start with Adani first with this one.
Sure. And kind of building off the last question, the telling regulators what to do is kind of one of my favorite things. And so getting the opportunity to always kind of reiterate things that regulators, technology developers, and deployers, so those suppliers that Kelly mentioned, and also the manufacturers who deploy that technology, kind of what they should be doing and how they should be handling this information. As we've kind of discussed, it's gone from data incredibly specific to the vehicle, and now we're seeing a lot more data points as it relates to an individual and all that information. And not all of it's necessary to build the better product or do the next thing. And so what we recommend most often is that regulators, the developers, deployers should ensure that privacy is a foundational principle when they're building in these technologies. So when they get that technology from the supplier and they're going to add potentially these other features or possibilities for data collection, thinking about, okay, what do we actually need? What is the bare minimum of information that we need from this system for it to operate and do X, or for it to offer this feature for the driver? Another piece of that is at that regulator level, manufacturers do have to report, hey, we had X amount of all those recalls that we see, they have to do a certain amount of reporting. So there is a level of information that is necessary for some of these features when we're talking about potentially lane assist, or most recently in the news, we've seen Tesla and their difficulties with the autonomous driving features. And that was a reporting that had to go back to NHTSA. So some of these capabilities and technology features do have reporting requirements. So understanding when they're building in these systems, what do I actually need to be able to either make a proper report that doesn't compromise an individual's privacy, right? And implementing the appropriate legal policy and technical safeguards when personal information is implicated in these technologies. Additionally, de-identifying information is always a baseline sort of standard. De-identification and anonymization of that data, detaching, any personal attributes of that data when it does go back. Impairment detection systems or any other sort of driver monitoring systems or the autopilot kind of features that Kelly mentioned, in addition to others, should be tested for the bias and their potential false positive results and their impacts on different communities. That's also a large piece of this. Certain communities might have different vulnerabilities that need to be accounted for in terms of privacy and data. And then, of course, one of the biggest ones that I think we're seeing here with the purpose of this conversation, in addition to others, driver acceptance through transparency is essential to ensuring that consumers feel comfortable and safe behind the wheel, not only physically, but also in their digital presence and with their privacy and data. And so these are recommendations that we offer not only to the regulators who are thinking about these different rules, so the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Department of Transportation at the federal and state levels, but then also, of course, to those auto manufacturers and to the different suppliers that kind of develop and build these tools. And so those safeguards are things that need to be essential from the moment of idea and creation all the way through to the end. I think one of the other things to think about is the comprehensive privacy, which we've mentioned, and I think we'll get into a bit more, but different states, and I think there was a question as well, different states do have certain legislation as it relates to vehicle privacy. I think my favorite one, and think the only one at the moment that's actually a law on the books is in California. There's an in-vehicle camera bill law, that passed last October, went into practice this year. And that in-vehicle camera law requires not only large notices and multiple notices from the manufacturer and the dealer to the consumer when they're buying a vehicle with in-cabin cameras, but then also sets out standards for what can and cannot happen with that information. It's a really kind of good basis for understanding if we're going to focus a whole bill or legislation on the vehicle privacy and the different technology and data that's coming from it. This bill, I think, was really well done. Unfortunately, it's state level, so we don't see that at the federal level or across the board, and I'll pause there.
I think the only thing that I would add there, I think minimizing the amount of data collected is really important. And the California bill does another thing that we really like, which is limiting the purpose limitations around how things can be used. And I think that would be so comforting as a driver if it applied to, I mean, cameras are very important, but I mean, if you think about that applying to location, all of the other data that's collected, it's for safety purposes, and that's it. It's not for marketing. It's not for insurance. I think that would really help a lot of us feel a lot better about driving these things.
Right. I'll add one more thing to that. So minimizing the amount of data that is only necessary, as Adani said, to make the feature work correctly is key there. And, there are potential needs for some data for defect investigations, crash investigations, et cetera. But again, I've talked with some of those involved in those types of investigations before. And of course, for them, more data, more better. But for the consumer, the only data that is actually necessary for those types of investigations is truly just, was the feature on and was the feature operating correctly, and doesn't need to go as far as what the driver was doing or turn into any sort of victim blaming game, which we have seen in the past, especially with some of these driver monitoring cameras. We've seen very, very quickly how that data gets put into the headlines, right? Where the driver was doing X, Y, and Z, and it turns into a victim blame game rather than truly for the benefit of improving the system or to investigate defects or other types of investigations.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So it seems like automakers shape the definition of safety on the road that solely focus on avoiding car crashes. What are other ways that folks can think about safety in the context of privacy? I know Thorn sort of mentioned that his wife could sort of track his car behavior, which, might be a little intrusive, but, he also mentioned non-consensual sharing of location data with maybe ex-partners. So wondering if, someone could sort of elaborate on that.
Sure. I will say that consent should always be enthusiastic consent and not forced consent. Sometimes when you purchase a new vehicle, which we do at least once a week here at Consumer Reports, sometimes you are essentially forced to just click through some privacy policies and sharing of data types of things in order to be able to use the car. I wouldn't consider that enthusiastic consent. And some of the concerns that we've talked about is are when you purchase a feature, especially, like an autopilot type feature or something like that, you spend extra money on it. And then in order to actually use it, you then have to give up more of your privacy, which doesn't feel very consensual either. So, there are benefits of using these systems. And I'll point back to some of the ones Adani was talking to earlier, impairment detection technologies. These are technologies that are safety features. Whether or not you want them in your own car, you probably want them in all the cars around you. I probably can't count how many times I drive home and I see people on their phone, or maybe they're impaired by alcohol or other drugs or drowsy, et cetera. You really want everyone else on the road to have these features, so you'll probably get it in your car too. But we want to have those types of features in the car for everyone's safety, because you don't want to, become victim to one of those types of crashes. But in order to get them on cars faster, there really needs to be some sort of federal level legislation to ensure that consumer privacy is front and center. similar to what is going on in California, because I don't think anyone should be asking for these cameras and other sensors to be in a car with unconsensual, force. And so to make the roadways safer for everyone, we want these, but there need to be protections put into place right now from the beginning before the technology is really widespread, so that we can benefit from the technology without having to give up our data privacy.
I think that was incredibly well said. That is exactly it. In the report that we did in the consumer survey, excuse me, that we conducted, that was exactly the sentiment for most individuals who responded was, we would love these features for safety, but we have concerns about privacy, where that information is going, what's happening. And I think the biggest thing to take away is that privacy and safety can both exist. They are not at odds with one another, especially when we start to think about the amazing capabilities of these new technologies in vehicles. But all of these kind of protections, as I mentioned, need to start happening at the outset. When they are starting to be implemented into vehicles, they need to go through all the testing and ensure that they are protecting again, your physical self, but also providing you the option for decisions as it relates to your privacy and to your data, and are not causing potential, I think it's been mentioned earlier, or who else benefits from that data? There are other people who do want to benefit from that data, potentially an insurance company, and there are real implications for certain drivers and individuals who, might want a better deal, and so they agree to have tracking, or those who, can potentially afford a higher insurance cost. But there's also differences in where people live. And so there's a whole other kind of side of this that relates to how you are as an individual, where you live and are operating your vehicle. And so thinking about that from the manufacturers and from the regulator side is a big point. And of course, all of the things that we've mentioned as well.
Fantastic. So just checking on time, we have 12 minutes and we have lots of questions from the audience. So I'm going to go through a couple and just speak them out here. So Kevin asks, my insurance company obtains my driving info so I can get a discount. I've twice requested the formula for calculating my score and they dodge answering. Legally, should they provide this info to be transparent? And I also see Matt has offered to answer this question as well. So Matt, if you also want to answer, feel free to.
Sorry, it's just flagging that for the group.
Thank you for the question. I am not going to purport to have a perfect answer or an albeit answer. I will just say it'd be great if everyone did have transparency. I think here, because there is the consent feature to actually actively having the driving info features turned on, I'm not quite sure what that relationship looks like. I would investigate the potential for revoking that consent and potentially asking for any reports that came out of when that consent was turned on. But I wish everyone would provide all information, but I can't say that it's something that they would be legally required to do in this instance because there was consent.
Gotcha. Thank you. So I know we kind of touched upon legislation. We've confirmed that there's no federal legislation at this point. Adani, you mentioned, and Thorne, that there's a couple of protections in California that folks have when it comes to sort of data sharing in cars. So people are asking, what if I'm not in California? What if there are no good laws in my state? Like, what can I do about this? So does anyone have any sort of guidance on that?
I think it's still worth making those requests. Like I mentioned, I have heard from people who have had varying levels of success. But it's worth trying. It's 5 minutes of your time, and it annoys the car makers if nothing else. But otherwise, I think just pushing your local lawmakers for privacy laws. That's the best thing you can do, sadly.
I'll just add that on your behalf, all three of our organizations, and I know many others, are trying to push, any or influence any sort of regulation or proposed rulemaking out there on specifically the impairment detection technology. There was what we call an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking put out by NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, and us Consumer Reports, as well as my fellow panelists here. We all, our comments that we submitted to them were directly related to, ensuring consumer privacy. So if these technologies are going into vehicles, privacy needs to be number one for both consumer acceptance and just general, consumer good. So I think Thorin is totally right. Emails, call whoever you can in your specific state or locality to make sure that they're aware that you're paying attention to these types of things. And we will continue to also fight on your behalf because we know that this is such an important issue.
Great. Another question is, if I were in an accident, would the police and potential attorneys involved in the lawsuits be able to access that information? Seeing a couple nods, so whoever wants to take that.
Yes and no. So the police generally don't have in their vehicles the tools to kind of tap into the onboard computers. Other investigators generally can do that, especially if a fatality is involved. Then sometimes they will go that far to kind of check what we call the black box, right? The onboard computer. There is a little bit of data that is recorded to that. And it's not easily accessible, but it is accessible for those types of investigators. The more concerning, I would say, data is what is being transmitted off of the car, which can be much more than what is recorded on that black box. So, all these other sensors and other types of data can be transmitted off of the car. And that's where we, have seen some of the victim blaming in the past, right? And so we want to have all of those types of protections in place, but again, we just don't have that type of consumer protection right now in the United States, and we would really love to see that.
So next question from Brian. Is my car sending data via a cellular connection at all times, even if I'm not using any cellular devices in the car itself, such as GPS?
I'll tackle this, and then I saw Donna come off of mute too. So I'll go quickly. So small type amount of data is sometimes streamed, but generally the data dump, I'll call it, transmission happens when the end of the trip. So when you're parked, and oftentimes it's connecting, if you've ever connected your car to your Wi-Fi or other things like that, it's actually using that type of a network to transmit the rest of the data because there's a lot of it. So generally while driving, it's not as much, but afterward is when all of that happens. But Adani, you probably can answer this better than I can.
No, that's accurate. There are other methods for information to be transferred to and from the vehicle. So the cellular function doesn't actually require, and I think sometimes the cellular people automatically think the same sort of connection that our phones have. Sometimes doesn't always look that way. The connections kind of depend. I was going to say kind of the same thing as it relates to a lot of cars now will ask you to have that connection for your house Wi-Fi or for whichever Wi-Fi. Some vehicles offer Wi-Fi services in your car through actual telecommunications companies or directly through the manufacturer. And one of the reasons that they offer this is for convenience if you work on the car for whatever reason. And then the other is over-the-air updates. That's a new one. That is a feature that a lot of new cars are starting to work towards. So over-the-air updates, not only for the software of the car, but actually for other updates as it relates to functions, of cars. So for instance, adjustments to kind of the speed information. If you're using your maps and you have the in-vehicle maps and it tells you, pops up and it says, here is the speed limit in an area, the over-the-air updates can update things like that as it relates to your actual function of the car. So that's how the cellular, I'm trying to answer also some of the typing questions in the Q&A. But yeah.
Awesome, thank you for that. So I see you're typing in an answer to one of the questions, so I'll skip down a little bit. So do any of the cars have AI technology built in already?
Yes. The fastest answer is yes. Algorithmic technology, artificial intelligence exists in your cars, but not in the ways that you've probably seen most recently in the news. Algorithms exist all around us, and they have for a number of years. That's a whole different soapbox. But in the vehicle space, oftentimes there's algorithmic processing of a lot of functions and features and capabilities that are happening on the car. However, we are, of course, moving towards what else can AI do in the car? And so we've seen the Amazon Alexa has a relationship with certain manufacturers to have the Amazon Alexa. Some manufacturers are developing, I believe Lexus has their own AI sort of in-vehicle assistant voice recognition. And so it's existing in the car in a few different ways. We have not reached, autonomous vehicles, of course, also bring another level and layer of algorithmic processing and capabilities. And so it's been there and it's happening. So the fastest answer is yes. Different cars have different kind of levels and capabilities for what that actually is doing.
Great. And I know we talked about new cars and perhaps buying used cars. I do see a question from Tanya about rentals. So if I'm renting Zipcars, I'm being tracked, recorded, my audio videos, what are they doing while I rent the car? Maybe is there some tips people can keep in mind when they, first enter the rental car and when they return the rental car?
All right, so rental cars are kind of a unique case. Even if you go into all of those settings in the vehicle, the rental car, since they own it, they can oftentimes equip additional things on the vehicle, like you may have heard of LoJack or something like that, right? That has these GPS features on it and others like that. Some of them have speed governors to, GPS or otherwise software lock the maximum speed in the vehicle. So rental cars kind of have this added layer of more data sharing, and it's fairly difficult to kind of get around those when you're not actually the owner of the vehicle.
Thank you for that. So just taking a quick look at the time, we are coming up on the hour. So just going to kind of wrap up here. And just thank everyone again to the panelists for sharing such great insights on this very important topic, to the audience for asking such great questions. Just a couple of reminders, this is being recorded and the recording will be shared over email. We will also include all the different links of the different reports, resources, and actions that were shared throughout the webinar, so you can read more, get more information, or get more involved if you want to take action to get more protections. If you're particularly in a state that doesn't have a privacy law, and you want your driving data to be protected. So just, stay tuned. I'm sure we'll have more discussions like this in the future. And again, reach out to us if you have any more questions about what was discussed or and you can reach any of the panelists as well. Awesome. Thank you again for everyone's amazing questions and answers, and onwards. So thank you again. Have a great day, y'all.